Several times throughout Carrie Pierce's life, and especially the last 3 years, there were moments of despair. Just as she and her mother were moving to Idaho to start a new life, her mom went into kidney failure overnight with no warning. She was diagnosed with highly advanced multiple myeloma. Alone in a new community and devastated after losing both of her parents, many of you are going to be able to relate to the trauma and also the strength it takes to push through, to stay focused, and to win.
Have you ever felt like giving up, quitting, throwing in the towel? Welcome to Never Ever Give Up Hope featuring Carol Graham. She's an author, health coach, and motivational speaker. Backed into a corner multiple times in her life, Carol shares with you stories on how she overcame some of the toughest obstacles a person can go through in life, but refused to give up hope. Rather than admit defeat, an opportunity was presented, and it involves each and every one of you. Carol will feature spectacular guests who will share their messages of hope, encouragement, and their inspiration to prove why life's adversities only make you stronger. And now, welcoming the host of the show, here's Carol Graham.
Pierce has written professionally for more than 20 years. Most of those spent writing acclaimed health and wellness articles and books for midlife readers. She has attained her dream of working in the film, radio, and TV industry. She has been published many times and has also co-hosted 2 acclaimed internationally syndicated radio shows. She is co-director of Morgan Pierce Media and Publishing. Welcome, Carrie.
Oh, hello, Carol. It's a joy to be with you and your listeners today. I really appreciate this chance to visit.
And it's going to be an intriguing story I know that you are going to tell us, and we will be encouraged. And for that, I thank you in advance. So, tell us your story.
Well, you did a beautiful job of providing the cliff notes, and I will be very upfront and honest. The last 4 years of my life have been the most difficult, and that's on top of a life that already wasn't, I don't think anybody's life is a cakewalk, but
Mm-hmm.
my mom and I were best friends throughout life, and it was almost like the two of us made one person. We were that close. And back in 2014, my dad passed away after a horrible death, a horrible slide into Lewy body dementia. And for years, Mom and I took care of him, and it was extremely difficult. And that is just a horrible way to lose someone. It is a vicious disease. And after Dad died, we were left with a lot of PTSD, and we were left alone. And it took us a couple years to heal together, but we did, and we made a sweet life, Mom and I. And where we lived was starting to become quite dark. There was a lot of violence that was building. They had invited some not very savory groups into town, and they had taken over our small community. And we had lived there for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And Mom was, getting into her her mid 80s at the time. And I realized it was just the two of us, and it was my job to keep us safe. And the community was becoming just overrun with crime and drugs. It was becoming a very dangerous place. And so in my prayer time one morning, I heard this absolute command, move, move. And I knew Mom loved where we lived, and I knew she was going to be resistant. And I fought the voice, the Holy Spirit. I know it was the Holy Spirit. And I argued with him for 3 days in my prayer time, and he was insistent, move. And so I sat down with Mom that morning, and I said, Mom, I am getting a very strong direction that we are to move. We are to leave here. And she looked out the window for a minute and she said, I know you're right. We're not safe here. And I was surprised by that. And so we got a really good attitude about it, and we picked where we were going to go, where we knew we were safe and a like-minded community out of state. So we moved. We were moving to Idaho, where we had never been before, and we made a year of it. It was a lot of tremendously hard work, and we referred to it as our personal exodus. And we prayed a lot and lived on faith, and we got our house ready to sell. And the night the property closed and we no longer owned it and we no longer had a home, I tucked her in that night and I said, sweetheart, we've done it. We've done it. And I said, the hard part's over. And she got a funny look on her face and she said, I don't think so. Something's telling me the hard part is in front of us when we get there.
Oh, wow.
And I said, oh, no, no, no. It's going to be wonderful. And so that morning she didn't get up as usual. And I brought her a cup of coffee and she was laying in bed and I could tell she didn't feel good. And I said, are you okay? And she said, no, I don't know what's wrong. I don't feel right. And so I rushed her to the emergency room. And of course, they did tests and they ended up putting her in ICU. After 24 hours of tests, they just marched in a very uncaring way. And they actually said, well, you're at the end of the road. You're eaten up with multiple myeloma and there's no hope.
My goodness.
And I mean, they just dumped it on us.
Wow.
And it was the weirdest thing. My mom was always, she was passionate and loving and joyful, but things touched her and she cried easily. And I watched her when they dumped that news on us. I was sitting next to her in her hospital bed and I saw the muscles in her jaw clench. And there was no tear. It just became business. She never cried down to her last breath in the 6-month slide that we had between that diagnosis and her passing away. She shed no tear. Unlike me, and Carol, I need to be very honest with you, I had a complete nervous breakdown in that moment. Something inside of me snapped. I started to sob, and I'm still sobbing, and Mom's been gone now almost 3 years. It'll be 3 years in February. And so after the doctors left, we were sitting in her hospital room, and I said, Mom, I hate to bring this up now, but we have no home. We have nowhere to go. And we had bought a house sight unseen that was in the process of closing in Idaho. Our property where we had lived for 30 years no longer belonged to us, and we were homeless. And so she looked out the window for about 5 minutes and didn't say anything. And I said, we have some friends that we can stay in their basement apartment while you pass away. And they have already offered that, but that's all we've got to work with. And she stared out the window, and there were some people dealing drugs in the parking lot at the hospital that we could see. And she looked at them, and she looked back at me, and my mom was such a precious fireball. And she used the actual word, but I will not for the sake of censoring and profanity. She looked back at me and she said, we said we were moving to Idaho. We're effing moving to Idaho. And I said, okay, I'll make it happen. And we had already packed up all of our belongings. They were in pods, except for the last round of stuff. And we had to get people to help us. Somebody had to pack us up in our car and drive us here. And they left us at a motel. And we stayed in a motel where we knew absolutely nobody for 30 days while we waited for our house that we still had never seen to close. And we moved here with our 20-year-old cat who was absolutely traumatized. And so it was just this comedy of hellish errors, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And so when we got here, Mom almost died in the motel, and we ended up getting her to the hospital, and they put a port in and immediately started dialysis. She was about 2 days away from dying. And then an oncologist came in and said, we can buy you some time with a bit of chemo. And if we can successfully get your kidneys turned back on, you may be back in the game. And so
Hmm.
for 2 months, that was our life here. And of course, we got here in Idaho in the middle of one of the worst winters that they'd ever had. So we were buried in snow.
Wow.
So we ended up doing dialysis 3 days a week and chemo 1 day a week. And then that left me like 1 day a week trying to get us settled in the house. And we knew not a single soul here. And I didn't know half the time where we were going, and our dialysis chair time was 5:30 in the morning, so it was pitch black and snowing every morning. And it was
Hmm.
we just lived on prayer, and angel upon angel crossed our paths during this process. The people here were so precious and gracious. And we actually had one piece of furniture in our little house by the time we got in here. And the night we moved in, she went into flash fluid overload in her bed and almost drowned to death in her bed, which I will never get over. We were sitting on our little ottoman in the living room clinging to each other and crying out to God to save us. I mean, it was like living on the dark side of the moon.
Hmm.
We knew no one. It was nothing but medical trauma after medical trauma. And that is a feeling of aloneness that I don't think I have ever had before in my life, even with Dad and his dementia. But long story short, angels begin appearing. We had a horrible storm. Like the second night we lived, or actually the fifth night we lived in the house, mom was raced to the hospital, and they managed to get her lungs reinflated, and they kept her in the hospital and got her fluids under control with dialysis every day. And then we brought her home. And this horrible storm came through, and that morning was another dialysis appointment for her, and I had to get her there. And we were buried in snow. And I was praying, dear God, I don't know how we're going to do this, but I know you have us. I know you have us. And I got up that morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was just a blizzard outside. And I was making coffee, and I started hearing this weird noise outside. And I went to the window, and it was our sweet little neighbors we had not met across the street with their little boys out in the blizzard with snow shovels, shoveling our
Aw.
driveway.
Aw.
And I mean, I just couldn't believe it. And these angels. And I thought, how in the world did they know?
Right.
And somebody had told them, and I don't know how they knew, but they knew she had dialysis and had to get there. And so these angels just started appearing. And when Mom finally, we woke up one morning in February, and I knew she wasn't okay. She was pale and sweating. I called the ambulance, and they came, and it was a Monday morning. They said she just needs dialysis because dialysis patients don't get, dialyzed over the weekend, and that means Mondays are difficult.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they said she just needs dialysis. Well, I could tell by looking at her something was horribly not right. And they left. And, our chair time for her dialysis treatment that day was still 2 hours away. About an hour later, I called them back, and I said, something is not okay here. You've got to come back. And they came back, and they checked her again, and they said, no, she just needs dialysis. Why don't you get her there? Well, I drove her there, and they did an assessment on her before they put her in the chair. And the director came up to me, and he said, Carrie, something's really wrong. And if I put her on this machine, she'll go into cardiac arrest and die here.
Oh, wow.
You have got to get her to the emergency room. And so I raced her to the emergency room. And this was, of course, during the worst of COVID going on. And they told me to go sit in my car and to leave her in the waiting room. And I said, they have already told me my mom could go into cardiac arrest and die at any moment. She's afraid. She's alone. She's unwell. We're in a community where we know no one. And if you think for a minute, I'm going to leave her sitting here in a wheelchair all by herself in a waiting room where she could die at any moment, and I'm going to go sit in my car, you've got another thing coming. And I was nice and I was respectful. They called security on me. I did not leave her. They threatened to not treat her because I was not obeying the rules. It was a horrible situation, and I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And finally, a security man came, and he said, I will stand here with you. Do not leave your mom. And
Wow.
he understood the situation, and we got her in there. And we had been waiting for 2 weeks for her bone marrow biopsy to come back, and we just knew it was going to be good. And the doctor came in and he said, well, it smells like a bowel bleed in here, because mom had lost control of her bowels. And he said, that's not good. And he called me out in the hall and he said, I also need to tell you the bone marrow uh, test has come back, and it's worse than when we started chemo.
Wow.
And he said there is no hope, and she is dying. So she was hemorrhaging slowly, and that's what advanced myeloma sometimes does. And so we ended up getting back to angels on our paths. They came to us and they said, there is a beautiful inpatient hospice house here that we can get her in. It'll take about 5 or 6 hours to get the paperwork processed. And would you like to go there, the two of you, for her death? And, we said yes. We didn't know anything about it. I knew I didn't want her dying in that hospital.
Right.
And so 6 hours later, they came and put her in an ambulance, and I followed. And of course, it was snowing. And we drove and drove and drove and drove across town and pulled up at this magnificent establishment. It looked like a country club. And they were so gracious there. And they got her all comfortable in this beautiful room, absolutely gorgeous room. And there were hummingbirds on the bedspreads, and hummingbirds were my dad's favorite bird. And so they pulled her quilt up on her, and she was sitting there looking at it. And I said, oh, Mom, hummingbirds are everywhere here. I said, Dad's with us. And she said, yes, he is. And that was a sweet moment. And I noticed we were there for 3 days while Mom slowly hemorrhaged to death. And they took such good care of her. And I stayed with her constantly. There was one time I had to leave to come to the house to feed the cat, and then I raced back. But other than that, I was allowed to stay with her. I noticed, Carol, and I thought this was funny at first, every time a member of the staff came into this room, they would marvel at the bed Mom was in, and they would push all the buttons, and they'd say, oh, look, it goes up and it goes down. And they would always set the alarms off. And then, and I thought, how do you work in this facility and not understand how the hospital beds work? What is this? And everybody had to come in and see this bed she was in. And it struck me as weird. And so finally, about 2 o'clock in the morning, of course, I wasn't sleeping or eating. She was asleep, and a team came in to check on her, and they said, oh, look, and it goes up and it goes down. And it's so beautiful. And finally, I said, I have to ask you guys, every time a team comes in to care for Mom, you all stop and look at this bed. What's going on? And she said, oh, we have saved and done community fundraisers for a year to be able to afford this bed. It's called a cuddle bed, and it allows the dying person to be comfortable in the bed and the family member to cuddle with them. And
Oh
let's
my
show
word.
you how it works. But they said,
Wow.
and here's the kicker. They said, we got it this morning, and the minute we finished setting it up, we got the call about you and your mom.
Hmm.
We have saved for a year to be able to afford this bed, and it's in our best room, and you're the first ones to use it. And so that to me was a big gift from God.
Mm-hmm.
And so the nurse said, let's put the bolsters in it, and you can get in bed with your mom for a little bit and just let her know you're with her. So I did, and cuddled, and toward the last 24 hours, she started going into death rattles and became very feverish. And so I got out of bed finally with her, because I felt like I was making her hot. And
Right.
I went and dozed on the couch in her room. And whenever I would roll over, I would say, sweetheart, I'm still here. You're not by yourself. I'm still here. And as the evening and the night progressed, she started seeing someone in the room. It was a very palpable presence with us that I could actually feel. And she started talking to this presence, and she was talking in tongues, and Mom she didn't know anything about that, but you could tell it was a language. And she would communicate with the figure that we could tell was in the room with us, and then it would answer her, and it was a conversation, and it went on for hours, and it was like whatever was in the room with us was giving her directions about this will happen next, and then this will happen, and she would respond, and then she would ask questions in this language, and then you could tell she was getting answers. And that morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, I had dozed off, and I felt something take me by the shoulders very gently and stand me up. And it guided me over to the side of Mom's bed. I did not walk. It was not me walking. I could just feel this guiding presence taking me over to her bed. And she was doing something they had not prepared me for. It's called guppy breathing. And it's a very strange phenomenon. It looks exactly like what it sounds like a guppy fish breathing. And that's the last stages of respiration. And I called the nurse and I said, something's going on with my mom. I don't know what it is. And she said, I'll be there in seconds. And she was. And it was a nurse I hadn't seen before. And she said, oh, that's guppy breathing. And she explained it to me. And she said, it's just something the body does. It's perfectly fine. And she said, your mom's very comfortable. I can tell by looking. And she said, why don't you get in bed with your mom? And you're down to about 6 hours now. And I said, okay, I would like to run to the restroom real fast, which was in Mom's room. So it only took 30 seconds. And the nurse said, when I got back, let me tuck you in and get you comfortable with your mom. But you've got 6 hours. And I said, okay. And the nurse got to the door to leave, and she turned around with a funny look in her face. And she said, you know what? Why don't I sit in the room with you for a little bit so you're not afraid? And I said, I would appreciate that. So she sat down, and I looked down at Mom and held her in my arms in this cuddle bed. And I stroked her hair, and I said, oh, my sweet, sweet girl, I love you. I just love you so. Mom opened her eyes, and she looked at me, and she took 2 breaths and died. I looked at the nurse, and I said, oh, she's gone. She's gone. And the nurse looked at me. She said, no, she's not gone. I just looked at her. There's no way she could be gone. You've got 6 hours. And she stood up and she said, oh, my God, she's gone. And I said, yes. And she said, she was waiting for you to get back in bed with her. And I said, yes. And so the last words that I got to speak to Mom were, I love you. I love you so. And the nurse said, I have never seen any death like this before, ever. She said, this has been the most perfect death I've ever seen, and I've been a hospice nurse for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. And so they allowed me to stay in the room with her because there was no family to call. It was just, just us. And there were no friends. And so by law, you have 6 hours after a body passes, at least in Idaho, to get the family in, for last viewing or last whatever. Right. But then they have to call the funeral home. And they allowed me to hold Mom for 5 3/4 hours alone with her in that room. I couldn't let her go. And they were so gracious. They came in one at a time and expressed their sympathies. And when it was time, the director came, and in the meantime, I had to pick a funeral home, out of a brochure because we didn't know anybody. This had happened so quickly, and we had hope up until this happening that she was getting better. And so I picked a magnificent funeral home. They could not have been, and I feel God led me there to them. They were so gracious and so precious to Mom. Mom was a jazz singer and had made an album, and the mortician told me that when she was preparing Mom's body, they had actually bought her CD and played it while she was fixing her body. And I thought, that's another angel. What a precious thing. And they gave her the honor walk through the halls of the hospice facility, which I had never seen before. And they all stopped and thanked her for allowing them to have helped her pass. and they gave me hugs, and they came up and told me that they had learned a lot by watching us, which really surprised me because it was such a beautiful facility and there was so much love from the staff. And she said most of what we see is not this. It's a lot of fighting about inheritance.
Oh, of course.
It's a lot of,
Right.
and it shocked me to hear that.
Mm.
So I'm approaching the end of this saga, which I know has been very, very long, but it devastated me. And I always believed that God knew that we could not live without the other one. We were that close. And that the day that mom died, it was like having three-fourths of my body amputated. And I actually waited when I saw her draw her last breath. I really expected that he was going to
Hmm.
take me a massive heart attack. And I got ready. After about 10 minutes of standing there waiting to be struck down so I could go too, I actually said, well, something not nice. He's going to make me do this. He's going to make me do this. And, for 2 years, I've lived like I've had my skin ripped off my body with a rusty spoon. I mean, grief, there's no way to ever be ready for grief when you lose somebody you truly love and are truly connected to. It rips your skin off down to the bone. To have been buried under snow when she died in a community where I knew absolutely no one. There were many, many nights I was in the fetal position, just sobbing, I can't do this. Please let me go. Please let me come home. I want to come home. It's been the biggest challenge I've ever known in my life, but beauty has come from it, and incredible strength, as you said in the beginning of the show, has come from it. I am not at all the same person I used to be, incredibly strong, deeply resilient, whether I want to be or not. When mom died, I was 25 pounds underweight and all my hair was falling out because I never had time to eat. I lived on beef sticks and peanut butter, and the stress was unbelievable. So it took 2 years to get me back to health.
And here you are.
Well, sometimes that's debatable, but yes, no, here I am, and all of this reminds me of a fellow I knew years ago. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He laughed all the time. He was married. He had his parents that he helped take care of. They were very close. And in a very short period of time, he lost his wife to opioid addiction, and he didn't even know she was on them. He came home from work one day and found her dead and didn't even know she was taking opioids. Then his mother died. And then his father was diagnosed, much like mine, with dementia and ended up in a care facility. And he lost his entire family in like 6 months. And his personality, of course, changed and he became very lost for a while. And over the course of time, it took about a year and a half to 2 years, he began to return to himself. And I asked him one time, I said, Gary, I don't know how you've done this. And of course, this was years before my struggle came. And he said, well, there's something very freeing about after the worst happens, your greatest fear happens to you, then you don't have to spend so much time and effort worrying about it happening or trying to prevent it. It's happened, and now you're free. And he said the other part is once you lose your entire family, which I have, once you move through all of that horror and loss and crushing grief, then you finally are free of all those old stories and everybody else's stories and all the other family baggage that you've had to drag along in the family unit. All of that is gone now. And there is a freedom that comes where you can finally be yourself. But it's an awfully brutal, awful, ugly way to get there. And I have thought of his words many, many times, and it is true. All the generational baggage, all the generational stories, all the generational curses, all the little things and the petty things and all of that, they're all gone now. And of course, so is the sweetness and all the beautiful Christmases and all the precious birthdays and all the sweet moments. Those are now memories as well. There is like silver being refined in a fire, there is a purity that comes and a strength that comes and a part of you that comes out of all of this that you would never have been able to connect with any other way.
We could end this interview right now and feel fulfilled. The way you told your story is compelling, is not a strong enough word. I know that people, just as myself, have related to many of the things that you said, and I appreciate you going into as much detail as you did, and for touching our hearts today. For that, I thank you.
Well, thank you.
Now, we're going to take a very short break, a few seconds, and when we come back, we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about your books, your publishing company, and a few other things that I know the audience will also be anxious to hear. We'll be right back.
Carol Graham would like to show you the path from misery to miraculous triumph in her fast-paced memoir, Battered Hope. She relates her determination to succeed as someone who experienced one horrendous nightmare after another: gang raped and left for dead, loss of a child, husband falsely imprisoned, and cancer. Nothing could break her tenacity or faith. No matter what you face, heartache, loss, suffering, or injustice, Carol will illustrate how she became a victor the same way you can. The secret is to never, ever give up hope. Order your copy at Amazon or batteredhope.blogspot.com.
With me today, we have Carrie Pierce, who has been sharing her story about grieving that I know has touched every heart in the audience, and for that I thank you so much, Carrie. We're going to switch gears a little bit now, and I want you to share about grieving as a woman alone and your letter subscription service. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. And again, I should probably apologize to your listeners. I am a writer, so I do become wordy, and I'm sorry if that went too long. But grieving in midlife, I think, is much different than grieving at any other time. In my personal experience and through people that I have also talked with, friends that are grieving in midlife, loss of children or husband, older children, it's different. And you're grieving a lot of compounded loss by the time you're grieving in midlife. You're grieving loss of dreams, maybe loss of health, loss of vitality and or, what we consider beauty or youthful looks. You're grieving what might have been or should have been or could have been. You're grieving, relationships. You're grieving friends. So every loss that you experience in life, especially if you don't take the time to truly deal with it, accrues. And I think grief at midlife is profoundly compounded, and it is difficult grief. And in my case, it has brought me a lot closer to God in my faith. It is just surely by His grace I'm still alive, and several precious people that I did go on to befriend, and they've been very good to me. I have some lovely friends now in this new community, just angels on the path. And I think in terms of hope, if you will but ask, and if you will but look, there are people all around you grieving as well. And I think especially after all that we've been through since 2020 and the last couple of years with the whole COVID thing and all of that, there are people all around us deeply wounded, deeply grieving, deeply hurting. And grief always makes us feel like we're alone, like we're isolated, like it's just us. And I just want your listeners to know that is so not true. Everyone you meet, even young children today, are grieving loss.
Yes.
unlike a time we've ever seen. In the process of grieving and recovering, and I do see a counselor, and I think it's been a wonderful thing. You have to be careful to get a good counselor that is a perfect match for you, and God blessed me with one. So, when you go through profound grief, it undoes everything. And shortly after mom died, I had to then put our 21-year-old cat down, who was my last connection to that entire world with my family in
Hmm.
it. So that was the real kicker. I screamed all the way home in my car.
Mm.
But so you lose these things, and they accrue and they compound, and we're all out there thinking it's just us alone, and it's not. And so through this, about a year into my grief journey, as a writer, I talked to my business partner at Morgan Pierce, and I said, I think we need to create a letter service for grieving women,
Hmm.
50 and above. That it's a letter service where letters are actually come to your mailbox, and it's just the process of what I and a mutual friend of mine did. She had lost her husband, so we combined our experiences, and the letter service was called Letters from Elizabeth, and we ran a year of it, and it did well. And it was just letters about the grief journey, the grief process, what worked for them, what didn't work for them, things to try, things to think about, how to connect with this new self, how we hate the expression the new normal. But Carol, what we're doing with that now is we are actually turning that into a book. And it will be called Letters from Elizabeth, but we're turning it into a very compelling book. Of the letters will be included. There will be a place for journaling. There will be some tips and tricks and products that we tried that helped and things like that. So it's going to be kind of a grief compendium for women in midlife, and that should be launching in 2025. I wanted to have some goodness come out of such darkness, and I knew mom would want that as well to help other women. And men also need support and help, because there's a lot of men out there that have lost grown children, that have lost their pets, that have lost spouses, that have lost the last of their family. And I think men in today's society are kind of expected to just suck it up and get on with it, but grief completely undoes you.
Could you tell us about Morgan Pierce Media Publishing?
Absolutely. I have a wonderful business partner, Sandra Morgan, down in Houston, and then I'm in Idaho. And I had written for Sandra, and she had several online women's publications. I'd written for her for many, many years, and loved her dearly. She's very savvy, and she had wanted to start a publishing house together. And at the time, the community where mom and I lived was imploding on itself. I had to tell her, our whole lives out here are falling apart, and we might need to put this on hold. And she was very gracious to do so, because she waited for me.
Hmm.
And she was very preciously supportive when mom was dying. I mean, she called a couple times a day, or I would call her, or, crying. And so this lovely bond remained in place throughout this whole Exodus Odyssey. And after mom died, it was a couple weeks after mom died, I thought, I'm going to have to come up with a reason to live. And I called Sandra, and I said, I don't know if your offer still stands, but we are both writers. This is where our passion is. Helping other people tell their stories is our passion. And if you are still interested in forming a publishing house, I would love to do that now. And she said, absolutely. And so we are starting our third year. And some of our books have won awards, and we have some other books that are in the process of being marketed to film production companies. We're getting lovely press, national and international press now. It's been 2 and 3/4 years. It's a hard push when you start a business from the ground up. But again, when you step out on your faith, and when you persevere, despite all obstacles, despite all odds, and you just make the intention, I will survive this and come out the other end intact, and not only intact, but better, the universe and God just conspires to help. And We have a wonderful PR team behind us. We've been blessed with wonderful authors to work with. So Morgan Pierce Media and Publishing, you can check us out at morganpiercemediapublishing.com. And we're a hybrid publishing house, but we are extremely hands-on, and we are known for turning out quality works. We try to deliver books that have light-filled messages of healing, hope, health, family values, no agendas, no darkness, that kind of thing. I mean, if there's a story of overcoming where darkness is a fundamental component of the plot, we will of course do that. But if it's gratuitous, that is not the kind of material that we want to put our imprint on. So it's been 3 years or 2 3/4 years of tremendous growth and opportunity and challenge.
In the few moments that we have left, could you just give us a very short recap of your books? And they will all be described in detail when I post your interview, but just give us an overview.
So I am predominantly known as a children's book author. And my children's books are not kind of what you would normally think of. I write from a technologically obsolete point of view on purpose, and I don't talk down to children, so I use big words and, conversation, because I want to trigger conversations between the child and the parent and or grandparent reading the book to them. So my books are usually longer. My first book is called Abby Appletree, and she was a finalist in a book award competition, so that was a lovely thing. My second book is The Tale of Tommy Tomlinson's Tennis Shoes, and that one is 12 chapters and an epilogue, and it's about almost 40,000 words. It also has just been done professionally, and it's an audio book. A brilliant voice author, voice talent did the recording of that book, and he did a beautiful job. There's a lot of character in that book and a lot of different accents, and he just did a fabulous job. So it's also available as an audiobook, and that's the one that one of the books that we're presenting to production companies right now. And then there will be Letters from Elizabeth later, 2025. And Mom had written a serialized murder mystery back in 2012, I believe, called Becoming Billy. And it was a serialized story in a women's magazine. And she asked me literally on her deathbed if I would turn it into a novel for her, like she had always wanted it to be.
Aww.
And I am in the process now of finishing that, and the PR people have already lined up interviews. It's about sex trafficking in the music industry, and Mom was a jazz singer in Chicago in the 50s when the mob was extremely active, and they flew her to Hollywood to make her album, and she saw a lot of things. And so now with everything blowing up around all of the P. Diddy and the Jeffrey Epstein files and all of that, it's a very timely thing. So I am turning her book, Becoming Billy, a novel, into a novel which will be released the beginning of 2025. And they're already booking me for a lot of interviews to talk about sex trafficking, because I've had to do a tremendous amount of research on it to get this novel done the way Mom wanted it to be done, and her deathbed promise that I made to her. So those are the books with my name on them.
I'm looking forward to that one. Most definitely. And
thank you.
Yes, most definitely. In fact, I think we need to do another interview at that point.
I would love that,
We
Carol.
will definitely schedule that. Well, this has been an incredible time spent with you, and I thank you for touching so many corners of my own personal emotions. For that, I thank you. And also looking forward to the other things that you have discussed here, including, now, do you still have the letter subscription service or no?
We ran it for a year, and to be
Okay.
honest with you, it became, people all over the world wanted it, and it became so cost prohibitive because of
Okay.
shipping. The people that subscribe to it are in the process. We are they're receiving their last letters in the full year subscription. And that's why, to make it more affordable for people and more reachable, we're turning it into a book. And so, but this will be a huge grief compendium, but it will be one that is not heavy. It will be hopeful and helpful. So
well, you definitely have to make us aware of that as well when that's ready. So I
I
thank you.
appreciate that, Carol. It's been a true joy to spend time with you. I hope your listeners have gleaned something from my story today. I just send love to everyone, and just hang in there, and like your show says, never ever give up hope.
Thank you, Carrie. This has been a pleasure.
Oh, likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Never Ever Give Up Hope, featuring Carol Graham. Did you know that most people succeed because they are determined to? Quitting was never an option. Carol loves your comments and will respond to each one. So please subscribe and review this podcast. A rating of 5 stars would be outstanding and appreciated. Remember, if you are still here, there is always hope.